you've already had all your stuff stolen. If you decide that the general will is no longer represented by the majority, you're kind of SOL at that point. All your stuff has been taken, and you have no actual means of self-defense. When your framework for government is collapsing all around you, it does not help if that framework has also left you defenseless and destitute. Hello and welcome to part 16 of my critique of Rousseau's social contract. In this part, we're going to be covering Book 4, chapters 1 through 3. So here we go. Book 4, chapter 1 is titled That the General Will is Indestructible. It's another one of these chapters that says something about the general will, but actually doesn't make a very good case for it. Rousseau begins this chapter by saying this, quote, "As long as several men in assembly regard themselves as a single body, they have only a single will which is concerned with their common preservation and general well-being. ... The common good is everywhere clearly apparent, and only good sense is needed to perceive it." End quote. The idea that a group of men in assembly have some single will is something that is impossible to prove, and common sense seems to suggest that it is often, if not always, false. Rousseau is falsely collectivizing their wills and circumstances to hypothesize that there's something that they can do for common preservation and general well-being, which might not always be the case. And he also is assuming that this hypothetical will corresponds to that, which might not be anything that any of them are actually thinking. The problem, of course, is that the common good is frequently very much not apparent. That's why there are so many arguments for economic interventionism, for instance, and why it took so long to crack the code on marginal value theory. There are an unlimited number of things that we can choose to do, but whether any specific thing is good or not is usually not obvious, and there are an unlimited number of trade-offs to consider, as well as the effects of some policy that might happen at various points in time, in the short term or in the long term. All of these things confound absolutely Rousseau's conception here that people working together will always just know the right thing to do, and it's just not true. Rousseau continues with this next quote, quote, "Men who are upright and simple are difficult to deceive," end quote. This is, of course, not necessarily true. It's an ironic generalization that's taken to an unrealistic extreme here by Rousseau. He continues, quote, "When among the happiest people in the world bands of peasants are seen regulating affairs of state under an oak, and always acting wisely, can we help scorning the ingenious methods of other nations, which make themselves illustrious and wretched with so much art and mystery?" End quote. First off, I think it's worth noting that the fact that they remain peasants suggests that they may not actually be acting wisely in the long run. I heard this somewhere. I think it might have been Tom Woods, but I can't remember if he was quoting someone or who said it beyond that. Something along the lines of this. We cannot assume that our, that is to say, advanced civilized people's early culture was like that we observe in primitive cultures now. Obviously, there must have been some differences, and that difference is needed to explain why we advanced and they did not. This idea that these bands of peasants are so happy while being completely impoverished and completely at the mercy of some random noble, who takes his taxes from them without their consent, owns the land that they live and work upon. The idea that these people are happy could be because they have low expectations, or it could be because they are propagandized, or it could be because they have some kind of, system of thought that tells them that this is their proper place in the world. But all of these things are things that can be argued about. And we're going to see a little bit later on that Rousseau actually attacks the idea of deliberation and argument in a pretty significant way in these couple of chapters. He continues, quote, "A state so governed needs very few laws, and as it becomes necessary to issue new ones, the necessity is universally seen," end quote. The problem here, of course, is that Rousseau associates unanimity or near unanimity with correctness. This is not the case. Think of any sort of mass hysteria or mass action fueled crime against some kind of innocent person, and you'll understand what I mean. you have to recognize that this sort of thing can happen, is possible. This kind of thing where a bunch of people decide to scapegoat one other person, or not even necessarily scapegoat them, but just, aggress against them, and you've got a big group against a small group. This kind of thing is possible at any scale. And to ignore that, or as Rousseau is doing here, to kind of give it justification in the sense that the general will can never be wrong, is simply a mistaken philosophy that leads you down a lot of dark paths. Yet Rousseau continues, quote, "But when the social bond begins to be relaxed and the state to grow weak, when particular interests begin to make themselves felt, the common interest changes and finds opponents. Opinion is no longer unanimous. The general will ceases to be the will of all. Contradictory views and debates arise, and the best advice is not taken without question." End quote. Rousseau is attacking something very important here, and that would be the division of labor, and also the accumulation of capital goods. These things allow people to distinguish themselves over time, right? Division of labor lets someone become a dentist rather than just a generic doctor, right? It allows someone to be a car maker or a carpenter rather than someone who simply whittles, right? That's what division of labor does. The accumulation of capital goods has a similar effect, right? You can be a skilled engineer and you can work on cars and specialize there, or you can work on computers and specialize there. There is some overlap in these skills, and so the person might be able to go back and forth. But the fact that they are pushed into further specialization by the fact that there are these different piles of capital goods that are used to produce different things is something that allows them to distinguish themselves. For this reason, you expect a successful society to gradually end up with more groups over time, and for those groups to become more differentiated. This is something that Rousseau is against. He's talked about how kind of everybody should just be a farmer and live this kind of subsistence farming life, and that everyone should be, equally, involved in like government affairs or questions posed to the sovereign, quote unquote. But that's not the way that successful societies move. Successful societies move to create new groups that differentiate themselves, if by nothing else, than by division of labor and what kind of capital they work with in order to do their specialized job. Now, of course, if you have a limited state, assuming such a thing is possible, that allows that state to represent a variety of groups with different interests, because it doesn't take sides in any place where they vehemently disagree, right? It prevents force, fraud, maybe it puts out fires, that kind of stuff, but it doesn't say your children shall learn this, and even though you want your children to learn this, they shall not learn that, right? This is what a overly active state does. It forces groups to face the fact that they have differences, and then it picks a winner, and it then, by implication, also picks losers. Therefore, Rousseau's totalitarian framework inevitably leads to this sort of conflict, when a more voluntary system would have much less conflict. And there's even, shades of gray here. If all the government does is, police and courts, and maybe, fire protection and protecting from invasion, then it doesn't do anything with the schools. And so people who want their children to learn X can have their children learn X. People who want their children to learn Y can have their children learn Y. And the people who want to have their children learn X, there's nothing they can do to make the state force X upon the Yers, if that makes sense. Of course, these are all things where I would argue that limited government isn't really possible. You either have a voluntary association, or you have something where people are going to gradually chip away at whatever limitedness you have in the government, be it a constitution or even just cultural norms, to the point where you have a government that is unlimited, if not in practice, then in principle. But, again, if it would be possible for the X learners to never have any effect to force the Y learners to learn X, then there wouldn't be a problem. They could just have common police officers and common judges, and they'd be fine. But as soon as one group starts to impose its will on the other, and as soon as it's on, and especially when it's on something that they really care about, then that's when these conflicts occur. And of course, the solution is to dissolve or separate the state and lower its power rather than increase its power, which is its natural its natural tendency, right? It's like Hayek says, the worst people get on top. And when those worst people get on top, their worst tendencies are formed or not formed, but are promoted by the negative incentives that the structure of a coercive state creates. Therefore, Rousseau is basically creating a system that's doomed to fail. And he's already said so, right? He said, the state can't live forever, but it's our job to make it live as long as we can, which is already a really bad idea. So that's already, this quote that I was just reading to you, right? That the contradictory views and debates arise. These are things that are natural if people prosper. And they are natural when the government is totalitarian. But even more than that, we can say that Rousseau's implication that, quote, the best advice ought to be, end quote, quote, taken without question, end quote, is fundamentally nonsensical. The different groups have different best advice because they have different interests, because they have different incentives, because they have different goals. There is no best advice for all of them, except for possibly that best advice to be, hey, the government shouldn't do anything here and should leave people to their own devices. But generally speaking, people are not incentivized in that direction. The goal is to get power and to use that power to subjugate the other classes of people. Rousseau continues. When the state is dying, this isn't a quote, but it's paraphrased. When the state is dying, private interests call themselves the, quote, public good, end quote, and are passed under the name of laws. This, of course, is one of the major drawbacks of Rousseau's false person idea for what the state is. He's kind of cornered himself here into saying that all men should try to help the state live as long as possible, since life is obviously good, rather than observing that some associations may naturally be limited in time and applicability, and that people should let such associations lapse and make new ones which still serve their interests, rather than being trapped in this increasingly strangulated association that no longer serves their purposes. Instead, what we end up with is this stubborn class of tyrants who are hell-bent on keeping the state alive when its death is really no loss to anyone who isn't already using it as a front for parasitic activity. But Rousseau continues. Even when this happens, he says, the general will is intact but subordinated to other wills. The question posed to any prospective law changes from something like, is this to the advantage of the state, to, is this to the advantage of some group or person? Of course, it's really impossible to prove whether any individual is thinking of the good question versus the bad question, right? The incentives lean toward the people thinking about the bad question in Rousseau's thoughts. And here Rousseau is also making the presumption that the advantage of the state is good by definition, especially after he's already complained so much about states becoming bad. Clearly, if there are things that might be good for the state that are not good for the people, that create permanent minorities, enslave groups, parasitize certain groups, things like that. Anyway, that is chapter 1, and we can already see that Rousseau has trapped himself in a very bad situation. He's said so many things about the government having all this power and all this correctness that he is forced, willy-nilly, to kind of put his stamp of approval on some very nasty stuff. Because if the general will is always right, and if the majority always represents the general will, then you can do a lot of bad things that way. And to deny that as a possibility is to simply put your head in the sand. Anyway, let's move on to the next chapter. Chapter 2 of Book 4 is titled simply Voting. And Rousseau starts this chapter by stating that the approach to unanimity is a way to measure the approach to the general will. That if everyone was unanimous about something, then that conclusion would represent the general will. Of course, it makes more sense to actually say only that which is unanimous is actually the general will. Of course, people like Rousseau and even Locke and some of his, more freedom-oriented people have kind of already decided that a coercive state must overpower the people, and they will refuse to observe the alternative that, hey, what if we just had more organizations that, where each organization was actually voluntary, right? they kind of see it as a necessity for the organization to be coercive. And that's the thing that I think people need to try to, get out of that box and think outside of it, because, the problem with any coercive system is that the worst people are going to take those coercive positions and use them to their own advantage. If you get rid of the coerciveness of the system, yes, you have a little bit less stability, but stability grows over time in a more organic way rather than through conquest, whether that conquest be, material or political, right? Rousseau continues. He talks about how the existence of multiple castes can lead to a condition where there are, quote, two states in one, end quote, as in Rome's patricians and plebeians. But even when these two groups quarrel, he says, it's still common to have plebiscites proceed smoothly, by his own estimation, when government bodies don't interfere with these plebiscites. Now, first off, there was already a chapter called the state, the sovereign is indivisible, right? But forgetting about that contradiction, if there are two states in one, then each group is forced, but not bound to obey, right? This whole thing is kind of this nightmare plunder war of all against all, just like Bastiat talked about. You end up with these two states, but each state is trying to get power over the other, and by Rousseau's own words, neither group is bound to obey the other. They're only forced. So the whole thing just becomes this mess of, Group A forcing Group B forcing Group A. They all steal from both of each other, and you end up with a bunch of wasted energy and a bunch of, stuff that gets stolen back and forth for no particularly good reason, and not to anyone's particular, and not to anyone's, advantage necessarily even. People can steal from each other until they starve to death. Right? The thing about theft is that the more theft you have, the less people are incentivized to actually produce stuff. And so you can get to a point where everyone's just stealing from each other until they all starve to death. And that's kind of what we want to avoid. By making things voluntary, by avoiding the theft, by avoiding the coercion, we make it so that people are incentivized to produce as much as they possibly can. But Rousseau doesn't go that way. He goes in the exact opposite direction. And that's the point. That's the reason why this whole system is so absolutely broken from its very basis. You have this totalitarian state, which, if not in practice, is totalitarian in principle. And because of that, the people are kind of relegated to this life of subsistence farming. It's not good for them. It's not good for anybody else. Furthermore, it's not clear that all plebiscites proceeded smoothly in ancient Rome. And one possible reason that they may have been perceived to run smoothly is because of the system of majority vote itself. If all you have are records which say, this was the decision, this was the decision, this was the decision, it looks like everything went over just fine. The people voted, and then the winners won the vote. And having such a system makes these simple votes seem clear and smooth in retrospect, regardless of whether those majorities were won by persuasion or by veiled threats. Rousseau continues. However, he notes, unanimity also occurs when the citizens, quote, having fallen into servitude, have lost both liberty and will, ... Deliberation ceases, and only worship or malediction is left, end quote. He gives an example of the Roman Senate under Otho cursing Vitellius while making a lot of noise to ensure that nobody is liable if Vitellius gains power. Rousseau has kind of cornered himself into saying that arguments are evidence of either a weak state or a tyrannical state. Therefore, if there are arguments, then there's not really any legitimacy, is there? How do we objectively differentiate between true deliberation and mere argument, mere rhetoric? How do we differentiate between people who are convinced by logic, by evidence, by rhetoric, by threats, by the ability to steal from their fellow man? Rousseau doesn't offer any answers to this. He just says, it sure would be good if things were good. And that's not actually a coherent system. It provides mankind with no defense from tyrants. Rousseau continues, the social compact requires a unanimous consent. Quote, civil association is the most voluntary of all acts, end quote. Now, just semantically, voluntary is not really a sliding scale. Making voluntary into a sliding scale is one of the things that the state does in order to kind of obscure the coercion at its base, at its fundament, right? To use my beloved Netflix example, when you have a voluntary association, let's say that Netflix decides to raise its price from $13 a month to $15 a month. There will be people who approve and say, well, if we give them these $2 a month extra, what they'll do with it is they'll make good shows, or they'll license good shows that I want to see, and that would be great. And maybe they'll be like, well, inflation's been a thing, and maybe they need to expand their architecture, their infrastructure, and so I approve of this $2 per month thing. I can afford it, right? There's going to be that group, the group of approvers. Then there's going to be people who complain. They say, man, I don't want it to go to $15 a month. They make these shows with this extra money that they have, and these shows suck. And then they go and they license some garbage TV show that nobody wants to watch. They put it up, nobody watches it, it gets a bunch of one-star reviews, and then they take it off and get some other garbage, right? But these people still continue to pay the $15 a month. These people are complaining, but they're not really dissenting in any in a meaningful way, at least as far as the Netflix's bottom line goes. Then there are the people who genuinely dissent. They end their subscriptions. They say, Netflix, I refuse to pay you $15 a month. I believe that the $15 is more valuable. I believe that I believe that the value you provide me is worth the $13, but not worth $15 a month. Bam. That's actual dissent. Now, of course, in the situation of a coercive state, you can't end your subscription. And so the line between complainers and dissenters is actually quite blurred. If the state allowed secession, right, like actual secession, there are a bunch of people who would secede. There are a bunch of people who would secede and then come right back when they realize that not being part of this big organization has its downsides. And then there are people who would complain but not actually secede at all. There would be a little bit of chaos because whenever you change the system in a big way like that, people have to figure out where things work best for them. But at least they'd be able to figure out where things work best for them, as opposed to being stuck under horrible politicians who steal more wealth than a larger fraction of their wealth than the British were stealing from Americans right before the Revolution. It's worth keeping these things in proportion. Rousseau continues. He says that opponents to the social compact cannot be included into it by force. Hey, this sounds kind of reasonably good. But then he immediately says this, quote, he says that these people, quote, are foreigners among citizens, end quote, until the state is instituted, at which point, quote, residence constitutes consent, end quote. This is the idea of dominion that Locke had. And, it's actually really funny here because these people are foreigners. For the 5 minutes it takes to create a Rousseauian government, and then all of a sudden their consent is implied. It's, the foreigners among citizens thing is so short-lived that that's not even worth talking about, yet Rousseau thinks that this is some big distinction, and then he immediately goes off into another area. We're used to it at this point, I guess, right? Now, if you've ever seen any of the videos of me and my friend Justin talking about politics, you'll notice that we have a catchphrase, which is, it's worse than that. And it actually does get worse than that. Because Rousseau continues with a footnote that says that the above applies, quote, to a free state, end quote, since various circumstances, quote, may detain a man in a country against his will, end quote. Of course, Rousseau's whole framework makes it impossible to draw a clear line between a free state and an unfree one, so you're kind of screwed. There's nothing you can do with that. It's one of those, it's like a comforting word that doesn't actually mean anything. Rousseau continues. He says that majority vote binds the rest. They have agreed as part of the compact to all laws passed by the sovereign, and even to be punished for breaking those laws. And this is, of course, where limited government, if it were possible, could step in. Perhaps they have only agreed to obey certain types of laws. Why not? Rousseau is silent upon this possibility because it would destroy his entire framework. But he continues. The proposing and passing of laws happens under the question, quote, does this conform with the general will, end quote. And each man gives his opinion, and the majority represents the general will. unless, the majority is deceived or parasitic or something like that. You can think of a variety of different possibilities. Rousseau ignores all of that possibility. He says, quote, "This presupposes indeed that all the qualities of the general will still reside in the majority. When they cease to do so, whatever side a man may take, liberty is no longer possible." And there is literally no objective way to show this. It is rare, incredibly rare, for a government to acknowledge that it has lost the support of the will of the people, and even rarer for it to actually take responsibility and dissolve and abdicate. That almost never happens. Therefore, Rousseau's idea that the sovereign laws are only valid when all the quantities of the general will still reside in the majority, whatever that means, it's not measurable, is an impossible and unverifiable standard that practically no state will abide by. Furthermore, as we remember from Book 2, Chapter 7, a well-organized state will take everything it can from the people in order to make them basically helpless and defenseless against it. It's one of those things where you've already had all your stuff stolen. If you decide that the general will is no longer represented by the majority, you're kind of SOL at that point. All your stuff has been taken, and you have no actual means of self-defense. Yet Rousseau continues. He says something like, "It may not be that some questions require a simple majority." Quote, "First, the more grave and important the questions discussed, the nearer should the opinion that is to prevail approach unanimity. Secondly, the more the matter in hand calls for speed, the smaller the prescribed difference in the numbers of votes may be allowed to become." End quote. This is, of course, the first time that Rousseau has suggested that simple majorities don't simply carry the day. There's actually something interesting here to be explored. You could talk about how, we could have a constitution where issues like this require a simple majority, but then this requires 60%, and this requires 70%, and this requires 80%. The U.S. Constitution has stuff like this about how, you can make laws that are pursuant to the Constitution with a simple majority, but then it takes a certain amount more to repeal them. If you have the president with a veto, then it takes a certain amount to override the veto. Then you have the amendment process itself, which requires a much larger and more significant kind of support from the people and the states. These are things that would be fun and interesting to explore. There's all kinds of cool, not cool, but interesting rules that you could kind of make here. And if you've ever heard the old adage that we have each state is its own laboratory of liberty, right? Then each state, in a more varied system than Rousseau's, would be able to say, hey, what happens if we make it a 70% majority required to do this class of thing? You could try all that stuff. You could write a whole book on the possibilities of this and where, try to come up with reasons as to where your majority allows you to assume that the people who are left over are mere complainers and not actual dissenters, that kind of thing. But these are all things that are worth thinking about and maybe even talking about. But Rousseau just ends the chapter here. And that is the end of chapter 2 of book 4. It ends with an interesting question and absolutely no exploration of it. It's actually kind of hilarious. All right, book 4, chapter 3. This one is simply titled Elections. And you'd think that there would be a lot in here, but actually there's not. So here we go. Rousseau begins by saying that there are two possible methods for doing elections, by choice or by lot. Now, this sounds like a false dilemma, but at the same time, the word choice is so broad, so overbroad, that maybe it's true that you can kind of break any potential method into one of these two. Lot is not particularly broad, but choice is very broad. But anyway, Rousseau continues in this chapter by saying that Montesquieu says the lot, quote, is democratic in nature, end quote, and, quote, is a way of making choice that is unfair to nobody. It leaves each citizen reasonable hope of serving his country, end quote. Rousseau counters by saying, quote, these are not reasons, end quote. I mean, there are fairly obvious reasons that are just below the surface, but I guess it's asking too much to have Rousseau actually kind of read these things with a little bit of insight or thought. Here Rousseau is using such an clearly unfairly dense reading of Montesquieu that, to me, Rousseau just kind of made himself look like he has IQ trouble. I mean, I can make use of the same fallacy too. What does that say about the rest of Rousseau's argumentation, right? If I were stupid, I would say, well, Rousseau is taking Montesquieu out of context, or refusing to see the context that Montesquieu has, refusing to read between the lines. What does that say about the possibility that the rest of Rousseau's stuff is going to be any smarter, right? Rousseau continues, quote, "In every real democracy, magistracy is not an advantage, but a burdensome charge which cannot justly be imposed on one individual rather than another," end quote. The law lays the charge to magistracy. Everyone who has ever seen a government anywhere knows that this is almost never, if not never, true. If the people who are in the government are not very well paid, then they find ways to ensure that they are very well paid. And part of the reason that they're able to do that is because they have these abilities to create these coercive, decrees. They can create a winner and a loser in business, and just happen to invest in the winner. Rousseau says that in aristocracy, quote, "the prince chooses the prince," end quote, and, quote, "voting is rightly ordered," end quote. The circularity of this logic is kind of astounding, actually. I mean, that would be my obvious response. And whenever I see circular logic, I'm always reminded of an old Dilbert comic where I think it was Dogbert says that, you might say this is circular logic, but I prefer to think of it as having no loose ends. Rousseau then moves into an extended comparison between Geneva and Venice, and this is one of those places where he, I think, is banking on the reader not having a great understanding of these two different places. Rousseau has already cautioned us that things that work in certain places might not work in others. So there's no reason for us to make these two systems equivalent to each other. The extended historical or regional examples and comparisons don't actually help because, as Rousseau has said, it all depends on location, the type of people, the culture, yada, yada, yada. And in this particular case, where Rousseau is talking about Geneva and Venice, Rousseau takes a bunch of different things that share perhaps some similarities, and says that they are exactly equivalent, which is a stretch at best, and more likely to be something that is actually deceptive. Rousseau continues, quote, "In a real democracy, ... equality would everywhere exist in morals and talents, as well as in principles and fortunes," end quote. This is one of the earliest examples of commie gobbledygook that you might find somewhere. Equality in morals is unmeasurable. You cannot tell what is within a person's heart when he says, "This is my opinion." Equality in talents destroys the division of labor and puts everybody into poverty. Equality in principles is deliberately confusing. What does it mean to have equality in principles? Equality in fortunes is poverty itself, and, of course, bare subsistence. None of these things are places where you necessarily have or want equality. Equality in principles is the one that is most likely to be meaningful, and Rousseau doesn't actually expand on what it actually means. He hasn't used the idea, the word principle in any particularly meaningful sense so far. And, insofar as Rousseau has had the tendency of using bizarre definitions for things, I would like to have him expound on what he means by principles, and if these things are not just part of the law. Remember that he broke down the different parts of the law in an earlier chapter, and part of it is just the Constitution and the culture, in which case, you've got a definitional problem, as I mentioned back then, but then, then there's no sense of equality of principles because these things are constantly in flux. Rousseau goes on to note, very obviously, that lot and vote have no place in monarchy. To add them in where they weren't already there before is, quote, "to change the form of government," end quote. And if Rousseau didn't place an absurd emphasis on a man's duty to, quote, "to prolong as much as possible the life of the state," that's a quote from Book 3, Chapter 11, And if Rousseau didn't say that, quote, the established government should never be touched except when it comes to be incompatible with the public good, end quote, that's Book 3, Chapter 18, this wouldn't be so scary to him. It's a cage of his own making. And, it's one of those things where you can never actually conclusively measure whether the government is compatible or incompatible with the public good. And, there are plenty of reasons why you might not want to prolong the life of the state. And yet Rousseau kind of puts all that under the rug and just makes this sweeping statement and adds this statement in a tone that makes aristocracy and monarchy sound a lot better, even though he's already said that these are, that these have, negative effects, which he's mentioned earlier, and now he's kind of, polishing those away as well. Rousseau finishes this chapter by noting that the next thing that he's going to talk about is, quote, an account of ... the Roman Constitution, end quote, and how it gave and counted opinions when the people were assembled. It's worth noting that the next chapter, chapter 4, is extremely long and will likely be the topic of a full video. All right. That completes part 16 of my examination and critique of Rousseau's general will. He's kind of backed himself into a corner, and he's got so many bizarre statements from earlier that he made unthinkingly that he ends up tripping on his own feet and just kind of pretending that he isn't. It's pratfallish, if that makes sense. Anyway, next week we'll be covering chapter 4. Probably that chapter will be, as I said, one whole episode, because it's much longer than any other chapter in this whole book. And so, it's 7, 8, 9 pages, something like that. So I'll probably find enough to talk about in that chapter to do a whole episode. Anyway, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. As always, if you like the channel, if you like what I'm doing, there are things that you can do to help the channel in the description, and, the usual stuff, the usual YouTube / social media stuff also helps. Grateful for anything you can do. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Have a good one.